The studio lights were blinding. 15 million Americans held their breath as Emma Hartwell sat across from Barbara Chen, the nation's most ruthless morning show host, her hands trembling like autumn leaves. The countdown timer glowed red, 30 seconds until commercial break. Mrs. Hartwell, Barbara leaned forward, her voice dripping with false sympathy. Your mother-in-law called you a genetic mistake on national television yesterday. How does that make you feel? Emma's eyes, bright with unshed tears, found the camera. Her voice was barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of every cruel word she'd endured for 6 months. I just want Michael to be happy, even if that means... She couldn't finish. The words stuck in her throat like broken glass. Barbara's expression sharpened. She smelled blood in the water. Even if that means what, Emma? Even if it means walking away from your marriage? The silence stretched like a taut wire. 20 million people watched a young woman with Down syndrome fight for her dignity on live television, while her husband sat frozen in his Boston penthouse, unable to move, unable to breathe. Then Emma did something that would change everything. She straightened her shoulders, looked directly into the camera, and spoke with a clarity that cut through 6 months of whispered cruelties and public humiliation. I am not a mistake. The words landed like thunder. And love, real love, doesn't ask anyone's permission. Barbara Chen, for the first time in 15 years of television, had nothing to say. But that moment of triumph was still 24 hours away. To understand how Emma Hartwell became the woman who silenced America, we need to go back to where it all began. To understand the love that broke Boston's most powerful family, we need to start at the beginning. 3 months earlier, the Hartwell mansion on Beacon Hill stood like a monument to American aristocracy, its red brick facade hiding secrets that money couldn't wash away. Inside the mahogany-paneled library, Michael Hartwell stared at the oil painting of his great-grandfather, the pharmaceutical titan who built an empire on insulin patents and ruthless business acumen. At 32, Michael carried the weight of 4 generations on his shoulders. Harvard MBA, summa cum laude, VP of Strategic Development at Hartwell Pharmaceuticals, the golden boy who never golden enough. You're late. Catherine Hartwell's voice cut through the silence like expensive crystal. His mother stood by the window, her silver hair pulled into a perfect chignon, her pearl necklace catching the afternoon light. Even at 65, she commanded rooms with the authority of someone who'd never been told no. The board meeting ran over. Michael loosened his Hermes tie, feeling the familiar tightness in his chest that came with family obligations. What did you need to discuss? Catherine's pale blue eyes, the same shade that had intimidated Boston society for 3 decades, fixed on her son. The Morrison merger. Your father would have closed it by now. There it was. The comparison that never stopped coming, even 5 years after his father's heart attack. Charles Hartwell had been a titan, a man who could convince senators and CEOs with equal ease. Michael was brilliant, but he lacked his father's killer instinct. Catherine never let him forget it. I'm handling it my way, Michael said, the words tasting like ash. Your way isn't working. She moved closer, her heels clicking against the hardwood like a metronome counting down to his failure. The family trusts your judgment in business, Michael, but in life, she paused, studying his face. We need to discuss your future. Marriage, specifically. Michael's stomach dropped. Mother, the Ashford girl is perfect. Caroline's graduation from Wharton last month was lovely, don't you think? Her father owns half of Connecticut's real estate portfolio. It would be a good match. The words hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Michael thought of Caroline Ashford, blonde, beautiful, and as warm as a business contract. She'd made it clear at the country club gala that she was interested, in the calculating way that Boston society women were trained to be interested in Hartwell men. I'm not ready for marriage, Michael said, the lie feeling heavy on his tongue, because the truth was more complicated. The truth was Emma. 2 months earlier, the Riverside Community Center smelled like fresh paint and hope. Michael had started volunteering there as part of his mother's charitable obligations, the kind of public service that looked good in Forbes profiles and tax reports. But somewhere between serving lunch to elderly residents and helping kids with homework, something inside him had started to shift. Emma had been teaching an art class to adults with developmental disabilities, her face bright with concentration as she guided a man through watercolor techniques. Her dark hair fell across her shoulders in soft waves, and when she laughed, really laughed, it was the most genuine sound Michael had ever heard. You're new, she'd said, looking up at him with curious brown eyes. No recognition of his name or wealth, no calculation, just openness. I am. He'd found himself smiling for the first time in months. I'm Michael. Emma. She'd wiped paint-stained fingers on her apron before shaking his hand. Her grip was firm, confident. Do you like to paint? Before he knew it, he was sitting at a table with 6 adults who treated him like a friend instead of an investment opportunity. Emma guided his brush across the canvas, her hand warm over his, and for 2 hours Michael forgot about board meetings and family expectations and the weight of living up to a dead man's legacy. It doesn't have to be perfect, Emma had whispered as he struggled with the shading on a simple landscape. It just has to be yours. That night, driving home in his Mercedes, Michael had stared at the small watercolor painting on his passenger seat and felt something he hadn't experienced since childhood, pride in something that belonged to him alone. He started coming back, not for the photo opportunities or the tax write-offs, but for Emma's laugh and the way she saw beauty in everything, even in him, present day. Michael, Catherine's voice snapped him back to the library. You haven't heard a word I've said. I heard you. He straightened his shoulders, feeling Emma's warmth in his memory like armor. And I'm not marrying Caroline Ashford. Catherine's eyebrows rose with the precision of a guillotine blade. Then who exactly do you plan to marry? At your age, you should be settled. The board can expect whatever they want. The words came out harsher than he'd intended. My personal life is my own. For a moment, something flickered in Catherine's eyes. Not surprise. Hartwell men were expected to be strong-willed, but concern. The kind of maternal worry that only emerged when she sensed a threat to the family empire. Michael, she said softly, using the tone that had comforted him after nightmares when he was 8 years old. You're all I have left. Everything your father built, everything this family stands for, it all rests on your shoulders now. I need to know you'll make the right choices. The weight of 4 generations pressed down on him like lead. In the oil painting, his great-grandfather's painted eyes seemed to judge him across the centuries. But in his memory, Emma's real eyes saw something different. They saw him not as a Hartwell heir, but as Michael, just Michael. I will make the right choices, he said quietly, but they'll be mine to make. Catherine studied his face for a long moment, her maternal radar picking up signals she couldn't quite identify. Very well. But remember, some choices can't be undone. As she left the library, her heels clicking away down the marble hallway, Michael pulled out his phone. Emma had sent him a picture from that morning's art class, a little girl's drawing of a rainbow with crooked but determined lines. Beautiful things don't have to be perfect, her text read. They just have to be true. For the first time in years, Michael smiled without thinking about who was watching. But he had no idea that his mother had seen the smile through the library's reflection in the hallway mirror, or that Catherine Hartwell was already making phone calls to find out exactly what, or who, had put that dangerous look of happiness on her son's face. The game was about to begin, and Emma Martinez, the art teacher who painted rainbows with children and laughed without calculating the cost, had no idea she was about to become the target of one of Boston's most powerful women. But some battles are worth fighting, even when you don't know you're in one. The proposal happened on a Tuesday in the community center's garden, with soil under Emma's fingernails and paint smudged on her cheek. Michael had planned something elaborate. Dinner at the Four Seasons, maybe a string quartet, the kind of grand gesture that would make sense to his family. Instead, he found himself kneeling beside the tomato plants Emma was tending, pulling out the ring his grandmother had worn for 67 years. Emma, he said, his voice cracking like a teenager's, I know this isn't... She turned, saw the ring, and dropped her watering can. Water splashed across his custom Italian shoes, but Michael didn't notice. He was too busy watching her face transform from surprise to joy to something that looked suspiciously like fear. Michael, are you sure? Her voice was barely a whisper. Your family will learn to love you the way I do. The words came out stronger than he felt. Emma, you make me want to be the man I actually am, not the one everyone expects me to be. Will you marry me? Her answer was a kiss that tasted like tears and strawberry lip gloss, and the promise of every Tuesday afternoon they'd spend together for the rest of their lives. They were married 3 weeks later, in a small ceremony at St. Francis Chapel, with Emma's grandmother as the witness and Michael's college roommate as the best man. Catherine Hartwell was in Europe, conveniently unavailable for the wedding she hadn't been invited to attend. The marriage certificate was filed on a Friday. By Monday morning, every major newspaper in Boston had the story. Hartwell Hare marries Down syndrome teacher in secret ceremony. Love or liability? Pharmaceutical dynasty's shocking wedding. The Hartwell scandal, when blue blood goes red. Michael threw the newspapers in the trash, but Emma had already seen them. She sat at their kitchen table, a modest apartment in Cambridge that felt like a palace after 6 months of stolen moments, staring at a photograph of them leaving the chapel. "They make it sound like I'm a mistake," she said quietly. Michael knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his. "You're not a mistake. You're the best decision I've ever made." But even as he said the words, his phone was buzzing with calls from board members, family lawyers, and his mother's assistant requesting an urgent family meeting. The Hartwell empire was circling the wagons, and Emma was suddenly public enemy number 1. 2 weeks later, the Hartwell Foundation's annual gala was Boston society's equivalent of the Met Gala. 300 of the East Coast's most influential people gathering to see and be seen, while nominally raising money for children's hospitals. Michael had attended every year since he was 12, trained from childhood to work the room like a politician, to remember names and connections, to represent the family with dignity and charm. This year, he was bringing his wife. Emma stood in their bedroom, staring at herself in the mirror. The navy blue dress was simple but elegant, chosen specifically to avoid drawing attention. Her hair was swept up in a style that his grandmother's hairdresser had spent 2 hours perfecting. She looked beautiful and terrified. "I don't know if I can do this," she whispered. Michael adjusted his bow tie, his hands shaking slightly, and moved to stand behind her. In the mirror, they looked like any wealthy couple preparing for a night out, but the tension in both their faces told a different story. "We don't have to go," he said. "I can call my mother, make an excuse." "No." Emma's voice was stronger than he expected. "You've been going to this gala your whole life. I'm your wife now. I belong there too." But as their car pulled up to the Four Seasons, as photographers' flashes began popping, and Michael felt Emma's hand tighten in his, he wondered if belonging was something you could claim or something that had to be given. The ballroom was exactly as he remembered. Crystal chandeliers casting rainbow light across marble floors, the soft murmur of conversations worth millions of dollars, the careful choreography of American aristocracy at play. But tonight, the conversations stopped as they entered. Tonight, 300 of Boston's most powerful people turned to stare at Emma. Some faces showed curiosity, others displayed barely concealed disgust. A few, very few, offered genuine smiles. Michael, his mother appeared as if from nowhere, elegant in black silk, her smile sharp enough to cut glass. "How lovely of you to finally bring your wife." The pause before wife lasted only a second, but in a room full of people trained to catch social nuances, it might as well have been a klaxon. "Mother, I'd like you to meet Emma." Michael's voice was steady, but Emma could feel the tension in his hand. "Emma, this is my mother, Catherine Hartwell." Emma extended her hand with the confidence her grandmother had drilled into her since childhood. "It's so nice to finally meet you, Mrs. Hartwell. Michael talks about you all the time." Catherine looked at the offered hand as if it might contaminate her. The silence stretched for 3 heartbeats too long before she finally accepted the handshake with the enthusiasm of someone handling a dead fish. "How charming," Catherine said. "I do hope you'll enjoy tonight's festivities, though I suspect some of our traditions might be unfamiliar to you." Each word was carefully chosen, politely vicious in the way that only Boston Brahmin women had perfected over generations. Emma's smile never wavered, but Michael felt her fingers tighten around his. "I'm looking forward to learning," Emma replied with dignity that would have made her grandmother proud. Catherine's smile grew sharper. "How educational for all of us." As his mother glided away to greet other guests, Michael leaned closer to Emma. "Are you okay?" Emma nodded, but he could see the hurt in her eyes. "She really doesn't like me, does she?" Before he could answer, a familiar voice interrupted them. "Michael, there you are." Jonathan Pierce, Michael's Harvard roommate and current city councilman, approached with his wife Sarah in tow. "We've been looking for you everywhere." Jonathan's greeting was warm and genuine, and when Michael introduced Emma, both he and Sarah embraced her without hesitation. For the first time since entering the ballroom, Emma's shoulders relaxed slightly. "Sarah teaches special education at Boston Latin," Jonathan said. "I have a feeling you two will have a lot to talk about." As Sarah and Emma began chatting about teaching methods and classroom challenges, Michael felt a moment of hope. Maybe this would be okay. Maybe love really could conquer all. But across the room, Catherine Hartwell was holding court with 3 board members and the chairman of the hospital's ethics committee, and as Michael watched, his mother's eyes kept returning to Emma with the calculating gaze of a hunter sizing up prey. The real game hadn't even started yet. The evening progressed with the careful choreography of high society. Michael and Emma made their way around the room, encountering a mixture of curiosity, condescension, and occasional kindness. Emma handled herself with grace that surprised even Michael. She asked thoughtful questions about the foundation's work, listened attentively to long-winded stories about charitable endeavors, and managed to find common ground with people who had never spoken to someone like her before. But Catherine was watching, always watching. At precisely 9:30, as the dinner service began, Catherine Hartwell rose to deliver her annual speech about the Foundation's mission and achievements. It was a tradition as old as the gala itself, delivered from a small stage at the front of the ballroom, while 300 guests sat at their assigned tables, wine glasses catching the chandelier light. Michael and Emma were seated at table 12, not the family table, Michael noted, but not exiled to the back corners either. A calculated insult wrapped in plausible deniability. Catherine's speech began, as it always did, with gracious acknowledgements of major donors and touching stories about the children helped by the Foundation's work. She was a master of the form, weaving together humor and pathos with the skill of a seasoned politician. But as she neared the end of her prepared remarks, something shifted in her tone. "In closing," Catherine said, her voice carrying easily across the silent ballroom, "I want to talk about legacy, about the responsibility we have to ensure that the values we cherish, dignity, excellence, tradition, are passed down to future generations intact." Michael's blood began to run cold. This wasn't in last year's speech. The Hartwell family has been blessed with the means to make a difference in this world, but with that blessing comes the sacred duty to ensure that our charitable work, our family traditions, and our commitment to excellence remain uncompromised. The word hung in the air like a sword. Across the ballroom, conversations stopped. Society reporters leaned forward, sensing something important about to happen. Catherine's eyes found Emma's table. We live in a time when society often confuses sentiment with wisdom, when we're told that good intentions matter more than proven competence. But true charity, real love, sometimes requires difficult choices. Sometimes it requires us to acknowledge that not all decisions, however well-intentioned, serve the greater good. Emma's face had gone pale. Michael started to stand, but his mother's next words froze him in place. "Tonight, I want to acknowledge all the members of our family who understand that our work is bigger than any individual's desires, who understand that some sacrifices, however painful, are necessary to protect what matters most." The applause that followed was polite, but confused. Most of the audience hadn't quite grasped the subtext, but those who knew the family dynamics understood. They had just witnessed a public execution disguised as a charity speech. As Catherine left the stage and returned to her seat at the family table, pointedly not making eye contact with Michael, Emma's composure finally cracked. A single tear slipped down her cheek, which she wiped away quickly, hoping no one would notice. But the society photographers noticed everything, and by morning, the image of Emma Hartwell crying at her mother-in-law's speech would be on the front page of 3 newspapers, with speculation running wild about trouble in Boston's most controversial marriage. Michael reached for Emma's hand under the table. "We're leaving," he whispered. "No," Emma said quietly, her voice steady despite the tears. "If we leave now, she wins. I won't let her make me run away." So they stayed through dessert, through the charity auction, through the endless cycle of small talk and barely concealed gossip. Emma smiled when spoken to, answered questions with grace, and never once let the room see how deeply Catherine's words had cut. But as they finally left the Four Seasons at midnight, walking hand in hand toward their car while photographers snapped pictures from across the street, Emma finally allowed herself to break down. "She hates me," she sobbed against Michael's chest. "She really truly hates me." Michael held her tighter, feeling the weight of his mother's disapproval and his own cowardice crushing down on him. He had stood there and let Catherine humiliate his wife in front of Boston society. He had chosen silence over courage, family peace over protecting the woman he loved. "I'm sorry," he whispered into her hair. "I'm so sorry." But sorry wasn't enough, not anymore, because Catherine Hartwell wasn't finished. The public humiliation at the gala was just the opening move in a war that would determine whether love could survive the full weight of American aristocracy's disapproval. And Emma, driving home through Boston's empty streets with her makeup ruined and her heart breaking, had no idea that the worst was yet to come. The video went viral at 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday. By the time Emma woke up, Donny Hartwell's scandal was trending on Twitter. TikTok was flooded with reaction videos, and her phone had 847 missed calls from numbers she didn't recognize. The footage was grainy but devastating. Catherine Hartwell, at what appeared to be a private dinner party, wineglass in hand, speaking with the casual cruelty that only came with assumed privacy and too much Bordeaux. "Oh, please." Catherine's voice was crystal clear despite the amateur recording. "Let's not pretend this is about love. My son married a charity case, a mentally deficient girl who can barely string two sentences together. It's embarrassing. The family is a laughingstock." The phone trembled in Emma's hands as she watched her mother-in-law destroy her dignity in less than 30 seconds of leaked audio. Michael thinks he's being noble, but he's throwing away 4 generations of breeding for what? A pity marriage. The girl will never be capable of being a real wife, a real mother. She's a genetic dead end, and she's dragging the Hartwell name down with her. Emma dropped the phone like it had caught fire. In the bathroom, she barely made it to the toilet before vomiting up everything she'd eaten the night before. When she was done, she sat on the cold tile floor and wept. Not the pretty tears of movie heroines, but the ugly, devastating sobs of someone whose humanity had just been stripped away by the person who was supposed to become her family. Michael found her there 20 minutes later, still in her pajamas, holding a towel against her face. "Emma, sweetheart, don't." Her voice was raw from crying. "Don't tell me it's going to be okay. Don't tell me she didn't mean it. I heard what she really thinks of me." Michael sank to the floor beside her, his face grey with shock and rage. He'd gotten the call from his assistant at 4 a.m. Damage control needed immediately. Board meeting moved up to this afternoon. Crisis management team already assembling. But looking at his wife's devastated face, corporate strategy felt completely meaningless. "She's wrong," he said fiercely. "About everything. You know that, right?" Emma looked at him with eyes red from crying. "Do I? Because sometimes late at night I wonder if maybe she's right. Maybe I am too different to be married to someone like you." "Stop." He reached for her hands, but she pulled away. "Michael, I can't have children. Did you know that? The doctors told me when I was 21, your mother is right, I'm a genetic dead end. The Hartwell line dies with you if you stay with me." The words hit him like a physical blow, not because they changed how he felt about her, but because he realized Emma had been carrying this secret, this fear alone. "I don't care about the Hartwell line," he said desperately. "I care about you, about us." Emma's laugh was bitter. "Your family cares, the board cares. Look at your phone, Michael. Look at the stock price this morning. Look at what loving me is costing you." He didn't need to look. His assistant had already briefed him. Hartwell Pharmaceuticals stock was down 12% in pre-market trading. 3 board members had requested emergency meetings. 2 major investors were asking questions about leadership stability. The leaked recording wasn't just a personal attack. It was a financial weapon aimed at the heart of the family empire. But Emma was wrong about one thing. The cost didn't matter to him. What mattered was the woman sitting on their bathroom floor, believing she wasn't worthy of love because his mother had convinced the world she was something less than human. 3 hours later, the Hartwell Pharmaceuticals boardroom felt like a tribunal. 12 men and women in expensive suits sat around the mahogany table, their faces grave with the kind of concern that was really thinly veiled ambition. In the center, Catherine Hartwell held court with the regal composure of someone who had never apologized for anything in her life. "The situation is untenable," said Harold Morrison, the chairman. "Our stock is in free fall. 3 senators have asked questions about our federal contracts, and the foundation's donors are getting nervous. Something has to be done." "I agree," Catherine said smoothly, "which is why I've prepared a comprehensive strategy to address this unfortunate situation." She slid a folder across the table to Michael, who had been sitting in silence since the meeting began. Inside were legal documents, financial settlements, and what appeared to be a prenuptial agreement dated 3 months in the past. "We're backdating a prenup?" Michael's voice was dangerously quiet. "We're protecting the family assets," Catherine corrected. "Your wife will receive a generous settlement, more money than she could spend in 3 lifetimes. In exchange, she agrees to an amicable divorce and signs a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement." Michael stared at the papers as if they might bite him. "You want me to pay Emma to disappear? I want you to clean up this mess before it destroys everything your father built." Catherine's voice was steel wrapped in silk. "Michael, be realistic. This marriage was a mistake. A noble mistake, perhaps, but a mistake nonetheless. The girl will be happier with her own kind, and you'll be free to make a match that actually serves your responsibilities." Around the table, board members nodded with the synchronized approval of people whose primary concern was quarterly earnings reports. Only Jonathan Pierce, who had been invited as the family's legal counsel, looked uncomfortable. "What if I refuse?" Michael asked. The silence that followed was loaded with implications. "Then the board will be forced to consider a vote of no confidence," Morrison said gently. "We can't have the company associated with this kind of instability. It was a corporate coup, wrapped in concern for shareholders and family tradition. Michael could either sacrifice his marriage or watch his family's century-old empire crumble under the weight of public scandal and board rebellion. "I need time to think," he said. "Time is a luxury we don't have," Catherine replied. "The longer this drags out, the worse the damage becomes. I need an answer by tomorrow morning." That evening, Emma was in the kitchen when Michael came home, mechanically preparing a dinner neither of them would eat. The afternoon's news cycle had been brutal. Cable news panels dissecting their marriage, social media trolls making memes out of her wedding photos, and a particularly vicious segment on a conservative talk show that made Catherine's leaked comments sound moderate by comparison. "How bad was it?" she asked without turning around. Michael loosened his tie, feeling the weight of 12 hours that had aged him 12 years. "They want me to divorce you." Emma's shoulders sagged, but she didn't seem surprised. "And if you don't? They'll remove me from the company, probably bankrupt us with legal challenges to the marriage, make our lives so miserable that we won't have a choice." She finally turned to face him, and Michael was struck by how small she looked in their kitchen. Not small because of her disability, but small in the way that everyone looked when the full weight of institutional power was turned against them. "Maybe we should consider it," she said quietly. "What? The divorce? Maybe they're right. Maybe I am ruining your life." Michael crossed the kitchen in 3 strides, taking her face in his hands. "Don't you dare say that. Don't let them make you believe their cruelty." But even as he said the words, a part of him, the part that had been trained from birth to put family obligations above personal desires, was calculating the cost of resistance: his career, his inheritance, his father's legacy, the jobs of 3,000 employees who depended on Hartwell Pharmaceuticals' success. Emma saw the calculation in his eyes. She saw the moment when love began to wrestle with duty, when the man who had proposed in a community garden began to remember that he was also the heir to an empire. "It's okay," she whispered. "I understand." But understanding and acceptance weren't the same thing, and as they stood in their kitchen, holding each other while the world tried to tear them apart, both of them knew that some fractures couldn't be repaired with good intentions and gentle words. Outside their apartment building, photographers waited with telephoto lenses and endless patience. By morning, they would have pictures of Emma crying, of Michael looking defeated, of a marriage under siege from forces too powerful to fight. But Emma Martinez, who had taught children to paint rainbows and believed that beautiful things didn't have to be perfect, wasn't ready to surrender just yet. The war for their love was about to enter its final phase, and sometimes the smallest voices carry the farthest. Tomorrow, Emma would make a decision that would change everything. The decision came to Emma at 4 a.m. as she sat in their living room watching Michael sleep on the couch. He'd been there for 3 nights now, unable to bear lying next to her while calculating whether their marriage was worth destroying everything his family had built. She understood the mathematics of their situation. Catherine Hartwell had made the equation simple: choose love or choose legacy, but not both. For a man raised to believe that his personal happiness was secondary to his family's empire, the choice was becoming impossible. But Emma had been doing her own calculations. 6 months ago, she'd first met Michael Hartwell not at the community center, but 3 weeks earlier at Boston Children's Hospital. Emma had been visiting her 8-year-old student Marcus, who was recovering from surgery to correct a heart defect. The Hartwell Foundation had paid for the operation, one of dozens they sponsored every year. Michael had been there for a photo opportunity, the kind of carefully staged charity visit that looked good in annual reports. But something had gone wrong with the script that day. Marcus, still groggy from anesthesia, had looked at this strange man in the expensive suit and asked, "Are you sad?" Michael had been caught completely off guard. "What? You look sad," Marcus had said with the devastating honesty of children. "Like my mum when she thinks I'm not looking." Emma had watched from the doorway as this powerful, polished man crumbled under the weight of a child's innocent observation. She'd seen him struggle to answer, seen the exact moment when his corporate mask slipped and revealed something raw and lonely underneath. That night, she'd looked him up online. Michael Hartwell, heir to pharmaceutical empire, Harvard MBA, 32 years old and conspicuously single. Every photo showed the same thing, a man going through the motions of a life that looked perfect from the outside, but felt empty within. So when he'd shown up at the community center 2 weeks later, Emma had recognized him immediately, not as the wealthy benefactor performing his charitable duty, but as the sad man a sick child had seen through completely. Present day. Now, watching him sleep fitfully on their couch, Emma realized that Michael was still that sad man. The difference was that for 6 months, he'd allowed himself to believe that love might be enough to fill the emptiness. But love, it turned out, was a luxury that men like him couldn't afford, at least not the kind of love that came without conditions. Emma quietly collected her purse and jacket. On the kitchen counter, she left a note written in her careful handwriting. "Gone for a walk. Back soon. I love you." She didn't sign it. They both knew it might be the last love letter she ever wrote to him. 2 hours later, the Boston Public Library opened at 9 a.m., but Emma had been waiting on the steps since dawn. She needed access to something that couldn't be Googled or found on social media: the archives of Boston Society magazines dating back 50 years. What she found there changed everything. 1987. Catherine Morrison, Hartwell's charitable work continues family tradition. 1994. The Morrison Foundation scandal, questions about missing funds. 1998. Catherine Hartwell quietly settles lawsuit with former business partner. 2003. Hartwell Pharmaceuticals, under investigation for patent manipulation. Try 10. The price of philanthropy, how Boston's elite used charity to hide wealth. For 3 hours, Emma read through decades of carefully buried scandals, legal settlements, and ethical questions that had been papered over with charitable donations and political connections. The Hartwell family fortune wasn't built on noble intentions. It was constructed on the same foundation as every other American dynasty: shrewd business practices, strategic philanthropy, and the ability to make problems disappear with enough money and influence. But more importantly, Emma discovered that Catherine Hartwell had her own secrets. The Morrison Foundation scandal from 1994 involved missing funds that had been quietly repaid to avoid criminal charges. Catherine had been 25 at the time, married to Michael's father for only 2 years, and desperate to prove herself worthy of the Hartwell name. The parallels were impossible to ignore. 30 years ago, Catherine Morrison had been an outsider trying to earn her place in Boston society. Now she was the guardian of that same society's gates, determined to keep out anyone who reminded her of her own vulnerable past. But Emma wasn't interested in revenge. She was interested in truth. That afternoon, Michael found Emma in their bedroom, packing a small suitcase with the methodical care of someone who had thought through every decision. "Where are you going?" His voice was hoarse from 3 days of board meetings, legal consultations, and increasingly desperate phone calls from reporters. "Somewhere quiet for a few days." She folded a sweater with careful precision. "I need to think. Emma, please. We can figure this out. There has to be a way. There is a way." She turned to face him, and Michael was startled by the calm determination in her eyes. "But it's not the one you want to hear." He sat heavily on the bed they'd shared for 6 months, looking older than his 32 years. "They're going to destroy me if I don't divorce you. 3 generations of work gone, thousands of jobs lost, my father's legacy erased." Emma sat beside him, taking his hand in both of hers. "I know, and I'm not going to let that happen." "What do you mean?" Instead of answering, she pulled out a manila folder she'd been keeping in her dresser. Inside were printouts from her morning at the library, along with something else, a letter from Boston Children's Hospital dated 6 months ago. "I've been doing some research," she said gently, "about your family's charitable work, about the foundation, about your mother's past." Michael's eyes widened as he scanned the documents. "Emma, where did you get these?" "The library, public records, and this." She handed him the hospital letter. "This is from Dr. Sarah Chen. She runs the pediatric cardiology program that your foundation funds. She wanted to thank me personally for something." Michael read the letter. confusion growing on his face. "I don't understand. This says you've been volunteering at the hospital for 2 years, that you helped develop a new therapy program for children with developmental disabilities." Emma nodded. "I never told you because it didn't seem important, but after Marcus's surgery last year, Dr. Chen asked if I'd help design activities for children who might have learning differences. It turns out that kids with Down syndrome are particularly good at connecting with other children who feel different." "Emma, Michael, I'm not the charity case your mother thinks I am. I have a master's degree in special education from Boston University. I've been teaching for 8 years. I've developed therapeutic programs that are being used in hospitals across New England." Her voice was steady, matter of fact. "I'm good at what I do." The room was quiet, except for the sound of traffic outside their window. Michael stared at the documents in his lap, evidence of a life his wife had been living parallel to their relationship, accomplishments she'd never thought to mention because she didn't need external validation to know her worth. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked finally. Emma smiled sadly. "Because I wanted you to love me for who I am, not for what I've achieved. But your mother is right about one thing. I'm not suited to be the wife of a pharmaceutical executive. Not because I'm not smart enough or capable enough, but because I don't want to spend my life at charity galas pretending that writing checks is the same as caring about people." She stood up, smoothing down her simple skirt. "There's a job offer in California, a non-profit that works with adults with disabilities. They want me to run their education program." Michael's heart stopped. "You're leaving. I'm giving you a choice," Emma corrected. "You can have the divorce your mother wants, and the board will reinstall you and everything can go back to the way it was, or what?" Emma's eyes held his with the same steady courage that had made her sit through Catherine's public humiliation at the gala. "Or you can come with me. We can build something new, something that's ours. But it would mean giving up everything here, everything you've ever known." The silence that followed lasted forever, and not nearly long enough. In it, Michael could hear the sound of his entire life reshaping itself around a choice he'd never imagined having to make. "I need time," he said finally. Emma nodded, picking up her suitcase. "I'll be at my grandmother's house in Framingham. When you decide, really decide, not what your mother wants or what the board expects, but what you want, call me." She paused at the bedroom door, looking back at the man who had proposed to her in a community garden and promised to love her despite his family's disapproval. "Michael, you told me once that beautiful things don't have to be perfect, but they do have to be true." Her voice was gentle but firm. "Our marriage isn't failing because I have Down syndrome. It's failing because you're still trying to be the son your mother wants instead of the husband I need." After she left, Michael sat alone in their bedroom, surrounded by evidence of a relationship that had been more complex and meaningful than he'd ever fully understood. Emma hadn't been the vulnerable woman he'd rescued from a life of limitations. She'd been his equal, his partner, his teacher, in ways he was only now beginning to grasp. And he'd been too blinded by his own family's expectations to see it. Outside, photographers caught Emma leaving the building with a single suitcase, her chin held high despite the tears on her face. The pictures would run in tomorrow's papers with headlines about the Hartwell marriage crumbling. But Emma Martinez, who had spent 2 years quietly revolutionizing pediatric care and 8 years teaching children that different didn't mean less, was about to remind the world that some voices, however quiet, could not be silenced. The next morning, she would make a phone call that would change everything. The call came at 6:47 a.m. on a Thursday. Barbara Chen, the producer of America's highest-rated morning show, had been tracking the Hartwell story for weeks, waiting for the right moment to land the interview that would define the scandal. When her assistant told her that Emma Hartwell herself was on the line, asking to tell her side of the story, Barbara nearly dropped her coffee. "Mrs. Hartwell, I have to be honest with you," Barbara said, her voice carefully controlled. "This isn't going to be an easy conversation. My viewers are going to want straight answers about your marriage, your husband's family, and these very public allegations about your capabilities." Emma sat in her grandmother's kitchen in Framingham, looking out at the small garden where she'd learned to plant tomatoes as a child. "I understand, but I think it's time people heard from me directly, don't you?" Barbara paused. In 15 years of television, she'd interviewed presidents and prisoners, celebrities and criminals. But something in Emma Hartwell's voice, a quiet strength that belied every stereotype about people with Down syndrome, made her reconsider her usual aggressive approach. "All right," Barbara said. "Can you be in New York by tomorrow morning?" 24 hours later, Michael Hartwell sat in his penthouse living room, remote control trembling in his hand, as his wife appeared on live television. He'd tried calling her a dozen times since she'd left, but Emma's grandmother had intercepted every call with the protective fury of a woman who'd watched her granddaughter's heart break in real time. "She'll talk to you when she's ready," Dolores Martinez had said. "Right now, she's got something more important to do." On the screen, Emma sat across from Barbara Chen, looking smaller than Michael remembered, but somehow more present, more herself than she'd ever appeared at family events or charity galas. "Emma," Barbara began, her voice gentler than her reputation suggested, "the whole country has been watching your story unfold. Your mother-in-law made some very harsh statements about your capabilities and your marriage. How do you respond to that?" Emma looked directly into the camera, and Michael felt his breath catch. She was looking at him, he realized. Through 15 million television screens, she was speaking directly to him. "Mrs. Hartwell is scared," Emma said simply, "and I understand why. When you've spent your whole life being told that your worth comes from being perfect, from having the right family name, the right education, the right connections, it must be terrifying to meet someone who finds value in different places." Barbara leaned forward. "Are you saying that Catherine Hartwell's comments came from fear, rather than genuine concern about her family?" "I'm saying that 30 years ago, Catherine Morrison married into a family that considered her an outsider too. She worked very hard to prove she belonged, and now she's trying to protect what she earned. The problem is she's forgotten that belonging isn't something you have to earn through perfection." In his penthouse, Michael stared at the television in amazement. How had Emma known about his mother's history? How had she understood the family dynamics that he'd never fully grasped himself? On television, Barbara Chen was having the same realization that millions of viewers were experiencing. They'd underestimated Emma Hartwell completely. "You've been portrayed in the media as someone who needs protection, who was swept away by a fairy tale romance with a wealthy man," Barbara continued. "But you have a master's degree. You've been teaching for almost a decade, and hospital records show you've developed therapeutic programs that are being used nationwide. Why didn't any of this come out before?" Emma's smile was sad but genuine. "Because it wasn't important to me that people know my resume. I wanted Michael to love me for who I am, not for what I've accomplished. But maybe that was a mistake. Maybe if people understood that individuals with Down syndrome can be teachers and therapists and innovators, they'd be less likely to see us as burdens or charity cases." "Speaking of Michael," Barbara said, glancing at her notes, "he's been notably absent from public view since your mother-in-law's comments went viral. Some are saying he's choosing his family's money over his marriage. What would you say to that?" The question hung in the air like a blade. Michael's hands clenched involuntarily as he waited for Emma's response. "I would say that Michael is a good man, caught between two kinds of love," Emma replied quietly. "Love for me and love for his family and everything they've built. Those two loves don't have to be in conflict, but his mother has made it seem like they are." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Michael once told me that beautiful things don't have to be perfect. They just have to be true. Our marriage is true. But he's being asked to choose between truth and everything he's ever known. That's not a choice anyone should have to make." Barbara sensed an opportunity. What if he chooses his family? What if Michael Hartwell decides that his corporate responsibilities matter more than his marriage? For the first time, Emma's composure cracked slightly. A flash of pain crossed her face before she regained control. "Then I'll be sad, but I'll understand. Love isn't about forcing people to choose you. It's about hoping they want to." She looked directly into the camera again. "Michael, if you're watching this, I want you to know that I release you from any promises you've made. You don't owe me anything, but I also want you to know that what we had was real. And real love doesn't disappear just because it becomes difficult." In Boston, Catherine Hartwell was watching from her Beacon Hill mansion, her face pale with something between rage and recognition. This wasn't going according to plan. Emma was supposed to be defensive, emotional, easy to dismiss. Instead, she was being gracious, dignified, human, and America was falling in love with her. "Emma," Barbara continued, "there are millions of people watching who have family members with Down syndrome or other disabilities. What would you want them to know?" Emma's eyes brightened, and for the first time in the interview, she looked genuinely happy. "I'd want them to know that we're not inspirational just for existing. We're not angels or burdens or teaching tools for other people's growth. We're just people. We fall in love, we have careers, we make mistakes, we have dreams that have nothing to do with being disabled." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "But I'd also want them to know that the world is changing. Slowly, but it's changing. Companies are hiring people with disabilities not out of charity, but because we bring different perspectives and skills. Schools are becoming more inclusive. Families are learning that different doesn't mean less. And what about you? Barbara asked. What's next for Emma Hartwell? Emma straightened her shoulders, and Michael recognized the gesture she made when she'd decided something important. There's a non-profit in California that wants me to run their education program. It's work that matters to me, helping adults with disabilities develop job skills and independence. Win or lose, married or divorced, I'm going to do work that makes a difference. Barbara leaned back, studying this remarkable woman who had turned what was supposed to be a sensational interview into something approaching wisdom. Any final words for your husband if he's watching? Emma looked into the camera one last time, and when she spoke, her voice carried the same quiet strength that had made Michael fall in love with her in a community center art room. Michael, your mother thinks I'm not good enough for your family. Maybe she's right, but you're good enough for mine. Whatever you choose, you'll always be good enough for mine. The interview ended at 9:23 Eastern Time. By 9:30, Emma Hartwell was trending on every social media platform. By noon, the Hartwell Pharmaceuticals stock price had recovered all its losses from the previous week. By 3, Catherine Hartwell had received 47 phone calls from board members, society figures, and charitable organizations, all delivering the same message. Emma Hartwell had just won the public relations war. And in his penthouse apartment, Michael Hartwell finally understood what his wife had been trying to tell him for 6 months. Love isn't something you earn through perfection. It's something you choose again and again, especially when choosing it costs you everything else you thought you wanted. He was already reaching for his car keys before Emma's interview was over. But first, he had one stop to make. The elevator to the 42nd floor of the Hartwell building had never moved so slowly. Michael's hands were shaking as he walked past his assistant, past the mahogany conference rooms and oil paintings of his ancestors, toward his mother's corner office. Catherine was standing at her window, looking out at Boston Harbor with the rigid posture of someone preparing for battle. I saw the interview, she said without turning around. So did 15 million other people. Michael closed the door behind him. Mother, we need to talk. Catherine finally faced him, and for the first time in his memory, she looked her age. The morning's events had stripped away some of her imperial certainty, leaving behind a woman who suddenly seemed more vulnerable than victorious. She's cleverer than I gave her credit for, Catherine said quietly. That business about me being an outsider 30 years ago, where did she get that information? Does it matter? Michael moved closer to his mother's desk. It's true, isn't it? Catherine's silence was answer enough. I remember Dad telling me stories about your first year of marriage, Michael continued. How your own mother thought you were marrying above your station. How the board questioned whether a Morrison was really suitable for a Hartwell. You proved them wrong by being perfect. By never making a mistake, never showing weakness, never giving them a reason to doubt you. And it worked, Catherine said defensively. I earned my place in this family. Yes, you did. But Emma shouldn't have to earn hers the same way you did. She's not trying to prove she's worthy of our name. She's trying to love your son. There's a difference. Catherine sat down heavily in her chair, looking older and more tired than Michael had ever seen her. You don't understand the pressure, Michael, the responsibility. Everything we've built could disappear if we make the wrong choices. Or it could disappear if we make the cruel ones. Michael placed a folder on her desk, the same documents Emma had shown him, plus several others he'd gathered from the family's private archives. I spent the night reading about our charitable work over the past 30 years. Do you know what I found? Catherine glanced at the folder but didn't open it. I found that our foundation has funded education programs for disabled children in 47 states. We've endowed research chairs at 12 universities studying developmental disabilities. We've built accessibility features into every hospital wing we've sponsored. Michael's voice grew stronger. For 30 years, the Hartwell family has publicly championed the rights and dignity of people exactly like my wife. But when one of them wanted to join our family, we forgot everything we claimed to believe. Catherine's hands were folded tightly in her lap. That's different. How is it different to fund a program for children with Down syndrome, but reject an adult with Down syndrome who wants to marry your son? The question hung between them, like a bridge Catherine couldn't bring herself to cross. Because, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, I worked so hard to make this family respectable, and she makes us look human? Michael finished. Mother, she makes us look human, and maybe that's not such a terrible thing. Catherine was quiet for a long moment, staring at the folder of documents that detailed decades of charitable work that had somehow failed to teach her the most basic lesson about human dignity. "What do you want me to do?" she asked finally. Michael had been dreading this question, but now that it was here, the answer was surprisingly clear. "I want you to remember why Dad started the foundation in the first place. He told me once that wealth without compassion is just organized greed." Michael moved toward the door. "I want you to be the woman who earned her place in this family through kindness and strength, not the woman who's forgotten what those qualities look like." He paused with his hand on the door handle. "And I want you to know that I'm going to California with Emma, whether the board fires me or not, because 32 years ago, you married a Hartwell and became part of something bigger than yourself. Now it's my turn." Catherine didn't answer, but as Michael left her office, she opened the folder and began to read about the foundation work that had been done in her name, with her approval, for 3 decades. Work that had helped thousands of people exactly like Emma Hartwell live fuller, more independent lives, people who deserved love just as much as anyone else. By the time Catherine finished reading, Michael was already on Interstate 95, driving toward Framingham and the conversation that would determine the rest of his life. But for the first time in months, he wasn't afraid of what he might find when he got there. Emma was painting in her grandmother's garden when she heard the car door slam. She didn't look up. She'd been expecting reporters all day, ever since the morning show aired. But when she heard familiar footsteps on the gravel path, her brush stopped moving. "Hello, Michael." He stood at the edge of the small garden where she'd learned to see beauty in imperfect things, wearing a wrinkled suit and 2 days of stubble. He looked like a man who'd been awake for 36 hours, making the hardest decisions of his life. "I saw your interview," he said. Emma added another stroke of yellow to the sunflower on her canvas. "What did you think?" "I thought you were braver than I've ever been." Michael stepped closer, but kept his distance, unsure of his welcome. "Emma, I'm sorry. For everything. For not defending you at the gala. For not standing up to my mother sooner. For letting you carry the weight of this alone." She finally looked at him, and Michael was struck by how calm she seemed. Not the fragile woman he'd been protecting, not the vulnerable girl his mother had tried to dismiss, but a complete person who had found her strength in the middle of a storm. "Are you here to say goodbye?" she asked quietly. "I'm here to ask if I can come with you to California." Emma's brush slipped, leaving a smear of yellow across the canvas. "What?" Michael sat down on the old wooden bench beside her easel, close enough to smell her familiar perfume mixed with the scent of oil paints and summer flowers. "I resigned from Hartwell Pharmaceuticals this morning. Well, technically I was fired, but I resigned first." His laugh was shaky but genuine. "The board voted no confidence after I told them I supported every word you said on television." Emma stared at him, processing the magnitude of what he'd just told her. "Michael, you gave up everything. Your career, your inheritance. I gave up everything that wasn't you." He reached for her paint-stained hand, relief flooding through him when she didn't pull away. "Emma, you were right. I was still trying to be the son my mother wanted instead of the husband you needed. But watching you on television this morning, seeing you speak your truth with such courage, I realized that I've been living someone else's life for 32 years. What about your family? The company?" Michael's smile was sad but peaceful. "My mother and I had a long conversation after I left her office. I'm not sure she's ready to apologize, but I think she's starting to understand. And as for the company," he shrugged, "maybe it's time for the Hartwell dynasty to end. Maybe I'm meant to build something new instead of just maintaining something old." Emma set down her brush and turned to face him fully. "Michael, you can't make this decision because you feel guilty. This isn't about proving something to me or to the world. This is your life we're talking about." "You're right," he said. "It is my life, and for the first time ever, I want to choose how to live it." He took her hands in both of his. "Emma, I don't want to be a pharmaceutical executive who donates to charity. I want to be a teacher's husband, who maybe finds his own way to help people. I want to wake up every morning knowing that the work I do matters, not just to shareholders, but to real people with real needs." Emma searched his face, looking for any trace of the obligation and duty that had driven him for so many years. Instead, she saw something she'd only glimpsed in their earliest days together: genuine excitement about the future. "The job in California doesn't pay very much," she said. "We'd have to live in a small apartment. No more charity galas or board meetings or society photographers." "Sounds perfect." "And no children, Michael. I meant what I said about that. If you stay with me, the Hartwell name really does end with you." Michael's eyes filled with tears. but his voice was steady. "Emma, you taught an entire generation of children to paint rainbows. You helped develop therapy programs that are changing lives across the country. You've influenced more children than I could ever have biologically. If that's not legacy, I don't know what is." Emma felt her own tears starting to fall, but for the first time in months they were tears of relief rather than heartbreak. "Are you sure?" she whispered. Instead of answering with words, Michael kissed her. Not the careful, protective kisses he'd given her during their months of hiding from his family's disapproval, but the passionate, certain kiss of a man who had finally figured out the difference between duty and love. When they broke apart, Emma was smiling through her tears. "California is 3,000 miles away from everything you've ever known." "Good," Michael said. "It's time I learned who I am when I'm not trying to be anyone else." 3 months later, the wedding was smaller the second time. Just Emma's grandmother, a few friends from the community center, and surprisingly, Catherine Hartwell, who had flown to California with a peace offering and something that looked very much like an apology. "I've been thinking about what you said," Catherine told Emma before the ceremony, "about earning versus belonging, about the difference between charity and compassion." She paused, looking older and somehow softer than she had in Boston. "I spent so many years proving I was good enough for the Hartwell name that I forgot to be good enough for my own." Emma took Catherine's hand with the same grace she'd shown in every public attack. "It's not too late to remember." Catherine nodded, tears threatening her perfectly applied makeup. "The foundation is setting up a new program for adults with developmental disabilities, job training, independent living skills, career placement. We want to call it the Emma Hartwell Initiative, if you'll allow us." Emma looked at Michael, who was adjusting his tie with the nervous excitement of a groom rather than the resignation of a corporate obligation. "I'd be honored," Emma said, "but only if the program is run by people with disabilities themselves, not just funded by outsiders, but actually led by the community it serves." Catherine smiled, genuinely smiled, for the first time in years. "I think that's exactly what your husband would have suggested." The ceremony itself was simple, vows spoken under California sunshine, promises made without the weight of empire or expectation. Michael's words were different this time, not the careful promises of a man trying to balance love with duty, but the wholehearted commitment of someone who had finally learned the difference. "Emma," he said, his voice carrying across the small gathering, "you taught me that love isn't something you earn through perfection. It's something you choose again and again, especially when the world tells you it's impossible. I choose you, not because you need me, not because I need to prove something, but because you make me want to be the man I actually am, instead of the man everyone expects me to be." Emma's response was equally direct. "Michael, you make me feel like I belong in my own life, not as someone's inspiration or burden or teaching moment, but as myself. That's the greatest gift anyone could ever give." 6 months after the wedding, the newsletter from the Riverside Community Center arrived in Boston on a Tuesday morning, delivered to Catherine Hartwell's Beacon Hill office, along with her usual stack of foundation reports and charity updates. But this newsletter was different. It contained a photo that made Catherine stop reading everything else. Michael and Emma Hartwell stood in front of a building with a sign reading, "California Center for Inclusive Living." Michael wore jeans and a polo shirt, looking younger and happier than he had in years. Emma wore a simple sundress and held a pair of garden gloves, dirt under her fingernails from the center's community garden project. The caption read, "Program directors Michael and Emma Hartwell have helped 200 adults with disabilities find meaningful employment and independent housing in their first year." The center's innovative approach combines job training with personal empowerment, proving that support should build independence, not dependence. Catherine studied the photo for a long time. Her son looked nothing like a pharmaceutical executive or a Boston Brahmin heir. He looked like a man who had found his purpose. She picked up her phone and dialed a number she'd memorized but never called. "Emma, it's Catherine. I know this might seem strange, but I was wondering if you might have time to talk about the Foundation's new programs. It seems we have a lot to learn from what you're doing in California." The conversation lasted 2 hours. By the end of it, Catherine Hartwell, a woman who had spent 30 years earning her place in Boston society, was taking notes from her daughter-in-law about the difference between helping people and empowering them. 1 year later, the story that had once threatened to destroy the Hartwell family became the foundation for rebuilding it. Emma's interview had sparked a national conversation about disability rights, family acceptance, and the difference between charity and justice. The Emma Hartwell Initiative became a model program, replicated in 15 states and 3 countries. Michael never returned to the pharmaceutical business, but he found his calling in something more meaningful, helping other people with disabilities start their own businesses and advocacy organizations. His Harvard MBA and Hartwell connections, combined with Emma's expertise and passion, created opportunities that neither could have imagined alone. And Catherine Hartwell, the woman who had once considered Emma a genetic dead end, became one of the most vocal advocates for disability rights in American philanthropy. She never fully apologized for her initial cruelty, but her actions spoke louder than words ever could. 5 years later, the letter arrived on the anniversary of Emma's television appearance, postmarked from Boston Children's Hospital. Inside was a photo of a young girl with Down syndrome, wearing a cap and gown, surrounded by her medical school classmates. "Dear Mr. and Mrs. Hartwell," the letter began, "my daughter Sarah is graduating from medical school today. She wanted you to know that she decided to become a doctor after watching Mrs. Hartwell's interview 5 years ago. Sarah said that seeing someone who looked like her speaking so beautifully about worth and dignity made her believe she could achieve anything. Thank you for showing the world that different doesn't mean less. Because of you, we have a new doctor who will spend her career proving that assumption wrong." Emma and Michael read the letter together in their small California apartment, surrounded by photos of the hundreds of people whose lives had been changed by their work. Outside their window, the community garden Emma had helped plant was blooming with vegetables that would feed families throughout their neighborhood. "Do you ever regret it?" Emma asked quietly. "Giving up the company, the money, the life you were supposed to have?" Michael looked around their modest home, at the handmade furniture, the paintings from Emma's students, the thank you cards from people who had found jobs and housing and dignity through their programs, and realized that he had never felt richer. "Emma," he said, pulling her closer on their second-hand couch, "I spent 32 years living someone else's version of success. Now I'm living my own. The only thing I regret is that it took me so long to learn the difference." Emma smiled and returned to reading the letter, but Michael continued staring out the window at the garden where dozens of different vegetables grew side by side, each unique, each valuable, each contributing to something beautiful and nourishing when they were allowed to flourish together. In a world that had tried to convince them that love required permission and belonging had to be earned, Michael and Emma Hartwell had discovered a simpler truth. The greatest achievements aren't measured in stock prices or social status, but in the number of people you help find their own worth. And sometimes the smallest voices carry the most important messages of all. In Boston, Catherine Hartwell kept that final photograph on her desk, Michael and Emma standing in their garden, surrounded by the life they had built together. Visitors often asked about it, and Catherine would tell them about her son and daughter-in-law, who had taught her that family isn't defined by bloodlines or social standing, but by the simple choice to love without conditions. "They remind me," she would say, "that the best legacy isn't what you inherit, but what you choose to build." In a world obsessed with perfection, they discovered that the most beautiful love stories are written by imperfect people who choose each other anyway, not because they have to, not because they should, but because when you find someone who sees your truth and loves it without reservation, you hold on tight, no matter what the world thinks it knows about who deserves happiness.